This is Lab 3 Part 2 in the Consuming Watson Services in Python on IBM Cloud series. In this course, we've been looking at the Watson language services, and now you can use those services to add language cognitive capabilities into your application. We have identified which language our user is using, we've performed a translation if necessary, we've used a natural language classifier to determine the intent, and now we're going to use natural language understanding. There are a lot of other services available, so we could determine sentiment, we could determine emotion. But we're going to conclude this series with keywords and entities so that your application has a fuller understanding of what your user is requesting of you. So let's look at the source code. It's in episode 6, Django in this version, and we've made a few modifications to this code, so I'm going to just show you what we've done. We've encapsulated some of the common functionality because as we're consuming more of the services, there's a lot of common code, and we've encapsulated those into a base class. This base service class looks after instantiating the service with the credentials. We're going to cover the credential and the credential store in course 3. The language service has been changed to use this base class, so it inherits off base service. And once the soup class has been constructed, instantiates the language service with the credentials. And all the methods have just been copied over. So we have still the get translation service, the identify language, check for translation, and perform translation, all largely unchanged. Actually, all unchanged. Similar changes to the natural language classifier utils class, but the body of the methods is unchanged. We've constructed a class for natural language understanding using the same model. Inherits off base service. So we pull in class from the Watson Develop Cloud SDK, and we only have one method, identify keywords and entities. We're using the natural language understanding analyze method, and we're extracting just the entities and the keywords. And if we do find entities, we pull out a 0th element, which happens to be the one with the highest level of relevance. It's relevance rather than confidence level, and the same for keywords. And we just return the primary entity and the primary keyword. So let's look at our main view. There's been some modifications into this. We import the 3 utility classes. The index view that is being used in the route. The Watson code has been encapsulated into a method invoke services. And the invoke services method here instantiates the 3 utility classes. As before, we identify the language. If it's a translation, we check for the translation and then perform the translation if there is one. And if the language we've detected is English, or we've translated into English, so if we have English translation, we perform a classification to determine the intent, and we determine the keywords and entities. This code is only looking at the English, but the service works as well for entities and keywords in other languages. Let's find the documentation for natural language understanding. And on this page you can see an overview of the service. If you have a look at the API reference, we'll see that there is some reference material for invoking the service, the analyze service in Python. And here we can see an example which looks very similar to the code that we have in our application. We need service credentials for natural language understanding, and we get those credentials from the IBM Cloud. So go back to the IBM Cloud, find our instance of the service, natural language understanding, click on service credentials, click on new credentials, and then click on Add to get our credentials. Once we've got the key and we've added that into our code, let's switch to the Django virtual environment, switch directories to the project that we've been editing, and run the application locally. Let's take a look. Running on port 8000 because this is Django. We'll tap in some text, taking into account our application is a box office application. And here we can see that a primary entity has been identified as well as a primary keyword. And the entity is different from the keyword. Keyword is a combined noun. Let's look at the trace from the application, the logs from the application. Total number of transactions was 2. And these are the keywords: Barcelona game and tickets. There is only one entity, and this is the difference between keywords and entities. Keywords are nouns that have been detected in the phrase. For entities, we have more information available that can be fetched. So for Barcelona, it's been identified as a city, and if there was some more information, Wikipedia information, that would be included here. If your application is not detecting the entities, you can create your own entity map using the Watson Knowledge Studio. Before we push, we're going to make final change to the manifest file, change the name and the host to be unique values. And as I record this audio track on this video, I realized that I forgot to update the runtime files. So when we push the application, we'll be requesting a 3.5.0 environment. And you need to be careful about this, because that would mean that we have a different environment on bluemix to what we're running locally, and that can cause unexpected problems. In this case, we're okay. But as I perform the push, you'll notice that when it pulls in the Python runtime, there it's 350, which is different to what we've been running on our local machine. And that's not good. Let's take a look at the application on bluemix. There it is, it's running. And we know we don't have a route at root. And we'll enter the correct URL and enter some text. And we can see that the primary entity has been identified as well as the keyword. Let's take a look at the logs. Actually, that was a trace command. We want to look at the recent logs. And here we can see total transactions was again 2, more keywords, and this time there's a lot more information that's been retrieved for the entity. If the service is not pulling out the entities correctly, you can use Watson Studio to create your own entity map, but that does come at a premium price. But you will then be allowed to import your entity map for your own domain. So now we have an application that identifies language, performs a translation if one is available, determines the intent, determines the keywords and the entities, and your application is now ready to process and act on the instruction that your user has provided. There are other language services available to determine concepts, to determine sentiment, to determine emotion. But I'll leave that as an exercise for you to add into your application.